Ruby for the syntax and semantics. Ruby is extremely expressive. Very nice thing. That's the first step. Yeah? I mean, to whomever you talk, I mean, they say Ruby is extremely expressive. Most of the features it has borrowed from the functional programming languages. So that's a nice thing. But then for you to write your day-to-day coding, you really have to know based on what the language has been built up. So that foundation is important. And that foundation is the Ruby object model. When I started doing coding in Ruby, I enjoyed this, the semantic for its expressiveness. But then I ended up writing Ruby code in a Java style. Then the time I started understanding Ruby object model, I had greater appreciation for what Ruby is and started rewriting the bad code that I had written. So this is a nice code that somebody has put it nicely. Now, a language that does not affect the way you think about programming is not worth learning at all. For the mere syntax sake, I mean, if you're going to learn another language, I mean, how does it solve a problem that we are doing in our day-to-day life? So Ruby is going to solve it in a different style, and that is what we are going to see. Okay, so the axiom, the Ruby object model is going to be the axiom, and axioms are not to be questioned. Okay, you start learning something with axiom as a basis. Don't question an axiom. Like in mathematics, when you try solving a theory or a thing, you start with the axiom, not try questioning why really things are this way. It's same thing with the Ruby object model. It is sort of confusing. I mean, we try digging too much into it. Why is it this way? Why is it this way? It's way better if you take things, okay, the Ruby object model is this way, and let me start building over it. That's one nice tip that I can give people. So, like in Java, the mother of all objects would be the in Java you have, right? I mean, the mother of all class would be the object, java.lang.object. Ruby is no different than that. Ruby has got this object. Now, typically any class that you create in Ruby, it's indirectly going to inherit the object, whether or not you're going to give it explicitly. Now, here is where slowly the confusion would start building up when people start learning Ruby. The class of object, if you see, I mean, it's going to be object dot, I mean, it's going to be class, the class itself, sorry. It's going to be the class itself. And funnily enough, or interestingly enough, the class of class is a class itself. And that's like, God, I mean, what is this? I mean, how can this really be there? And invariably, I think, everyone would actually try digging and no, I think I'm really wrong. There's something weird here. Probably my understanding is wrong. Why is it this way? And we spend a lot of time, days, some people weeks. I spent weeks trying to decipher that. I have not deciphered it, so I'm not going to talk about it today. On the other hand, what I started taking up is I thought, okay, this is an axiom. I'm not going to question this thing, and I'm not going to see why it is this way. Rather, I'm going to start with it. Yeah. Now, classes, superclass is going to be a module. Module and classes are, so one is same, just that the purpose with which they are used is different. Now, yet another twist in the Ruby's object model. Now, the superclass of module is object. Now, look at this. The superclass of module is the object, and object's class is class, and class superclass is module, and module superclass is class. Gosh, I mean, what is this? But that's the way it is. Do not question it. Don't try to, I mean, it sort of bogs you down. You try to decipher too much into it. Don't decipher this part. Just take it. This is the axiom. Okay? So, and now the object includes the module kernel. Yet another twist here. Now you have module here somewhere you see, and then you have the kernel on top. Where is the link between? I mean, don't try to look too much into it. That's an axiom. Just take it as it is. Now, all these has been the story till Ruby 1.8. Now, from 1.9 onwards, the answers to all class invariably is going to be basic object. Now, there has been a purpose. There's been a purpose to basic object. Because of the language's dynamism, there is a spell called black slate. You don't have to worry too much about it, but if you can just remember this, there is a spell called black slate. It does what this basic object is in reality is going to be. So you don't have to do that or implement that spell. Rather, you can directly inherit from the basic object. So you can have a class, yet another class, which is going to inherit from a basic object. That sort of simplifies things. Now we'll get on to see how classes are different in Java. Now, we're all aware of this design principles, right? I mean, when we code in Java or any other object-oriented language, like classes should be closed for modification and open to extension. Ruby is not really strict about it. I'm saying Ruby is not really strict about it. Not that Ruby doesn't bash about it. It's not that Ruby doesn't care a damn about this design principle. This design principle still holds good, just that Ruby is not strict about this design principle. Now, for instance, if you have a class, myClass, and then we can always add methods to the class like this. IAM is an instance method. That's typically the way you add an instance method to a class. And self.cm is a way in which you add a class method cm to a class. Now, this, how many of them think, quick show of hands think that this is a nice thing in Ruby? How many of them, quick show of hands, how many of them think this is nice in Ruby? Okay, so this is what happens. Open classes, wow. Some people find it very romantic, sexy, man. This is nice. I can just open any other class and then add methods to it. Very nice, yeah, no doubt. But there are also some who find this, no, I'm coming from a time, years I've been working on in a way that somebody used to tell me, hey, classes, I go by this design principle. Classes are supposed to be closed for modification and open to extension. And here is Ruby, it's odd. So after some time, this is the realization. It could potentially be monkey patching. It could potentially be an open class. Now that depends on, in reality, how you use it. So the guiding principle is, with more power comes more responsibility. Max is probably was inspired by the Spider-Man movie or even before that. So he felt, okay, I'll give the same responsibility to the apps developer who's going to code in Ruby. And I'll give them the power, and they're going to be more responsible. So if you're responsible, good to you. If you're not responsible, you will see, the monkey slapping on the guy's face. You'll be victimized by your own mistakes very soon if you were to, abuse it. Now, classes. So class methods in Ruby can be defined in a number of ways. You can always repeat the class name and then attach the method name to it. You can also use the word self and then have the class name to it. This is typically the convention that people follow. Because it's way easier. You don't have to repeat the class name time and again. And this is also another way in which you can define class methods. There is a purpose to it, which we'll see. Why it is this way, we'll understand in the forthcoming slides. So the other interesting thing in Ruby is this, classes or objects. Now we have seen in the diagram the class. The class is in itself is an object, and which means the definition for, take this my class definition that I have here. Now the same class can be returned this way. I can say class.new. I said the class, it's an object in itself. I can just instantiate a new class and assign it to a constant. Now, that means the my class is only a constant, but not typically a class, unlike the experience that people have in Java or C#. It's not a name of a class, but it's just a constant that is referring to an object of type class. If you have an understanding so far, let's get into a quiz to see where we stand. Quick quiz. So if you can just look through the code, here is my class that is inheriting from, the less than symbol is the way you inheritance works in Ruby. So my class inherits from string.new, and you have defined a class method inside. Now, if I say my class.2s, what do you think is the output? Can I hear answers, please? Any educated guess? Sorry? Class method. Okay. Any other answers? Are we all together here? Okay. So, absolutely, absolutely. So here's the lesson. Classes inherit from classes. Just because I said classes or objects, it doesn't mean a class can inherit from just about any object. That is not the case. So this is a sort of a confusion that people have. Okay, classes or objects, so I can always inherit from any object. That is not the case. This is an important, there is a point to be arrived here. You still have classes. You still focus on the way you template things. Classes are sort of a templates to an object. That is still there. The only difference being, in Ruby, classes are objects, which means what is typically applicable to your regular objects is applicable to your classes as well. That is the point that is to be taken. Yeah, people tend to have this kind of thing. You have a question? Yeah, please. Yeah, please. Yeah.
Logically speaking, no, I'm fine, thanks.
But for the sake of audience, sorry.
Yeah, so what I wanted to ask is, from a design perspective, why would you want to inherit from another object? Why would you want a logical entity to inherit from another object?
Fair question.
Is there any sort of, is there some real world application where that's kind of done?
So the example that I have drawn, that I've put here is just to prove the point that this never is going to happen. So because classes are of the type objects doesn't mean, we can randomly inherit from any object, which means your thought process in the way you want to design whatever classes, it still holds good. Just that the way you solve problems in Ruby, that is different. So your approach to problem, that is different in Ruby. And that approach is going to be exciting. Yeah, please.
There's two languages where you can inherit from another object, JavaScript and self.
Yeah, in Ruby, what I wanted to actually convey, probably I'm wrong, your thought process in the way you think of classes, in the way you think of objects, those things still hold good, is what at least I see today as a Ruby enthusiast. So my classes still remain classes, and this doesn't hold good is what I wanted to convey quickly in Ruby. Yeah.
String is a subclass of object, right?
Yeah.
Okay. It's not a subclass of class. That is a problem.
So this is about like you try to get too much into it, right? You've seen the action. Sorry.
Yeah, we are here to get into it. We are deciphering Ruby object.
So your object, okay. So the object what you have seen there is of a type class. It's not an object. That's another confusion that we always have. Object it's with a caps O. So that's the object is of a type class, and so it's able to inherit. You see the difference? So string is a superclass.
Object is a type class, okay? But object is not inheriting from class. That is
Very true. No, that is important. No doubt. Yeah.
this string is a subclass of object, not a class.
Correct.
Right?
Right.
So that is actually that's why the thing is.
Yeah.
If Ruby allows subclass of class, there is object, this class, and if you can subclass class, then this still holds.
You said this should ideally hold good then? Sorry. Can I? I'm sorry. Can I have it record? Okay. So can you, do you want to reiterate your point? Probably I'm wrong. I mean, I don't want to send a wrong message. So
For this example, you have shown, okay, class dot new.
do you want to have, oh, thanks. Oh,
What I am saying is, this is a trick question. Before this example, you have shown class dot new, okay? Okay?
Yeah.
And then you said, when you create a new class, you are creating just object. Class is object.
Right,
Class is object,
Right.
right? But problem is, string is not inheriting from class. It is inheriting from object,
right,
right?
right.
That is a problem. That's what I'm saying. If you are making a subclass from any class that is inheriting from class, then this should work. That will
Okay,
make it
agreed,
that will
agreed.
make it consistent. That's
So,
what I'm saying.
Agreed. So this is what happens internally in Ruby. Yeah, valid point. So when you do a class.new of something, it means internally you see it as a class, right? Now if I say string, for instance, or let's move to a previous example quickly. My class here, for instance. Now my class, because it is deriving from the class.new. It's an instance of type class. So you see my class as what? As a class itself, right? When you talk to somebody, when you talk in a vocabulary, you say my class is a class. Yeah, that's how you say it. But you do not say it as my class is an object every time. But the only thing being, this is what I wanted to convey. So you have invariably in Ruby, everything is an object, okay? So object is a bare minimum thing. And there are objects of type class. And there are objects of type ghost classes or eigenclasses, which we'll see further. But if you still have questions, can we park it and ask them towards the end? Sorry.
Basically, if instead of a my class, it's a string. If it is written string, then it's a object, right? You are inheriting from the object or the class, whatever you want to call it. But when you do string.new, it's a instance.
Absolutely. So that is where I'm coming to. So my point, what I wanted to say is, you have an object and you have objects of type classes. So that the only time this is feasible is when you can inherit from objects of a type class. In essence, that is the lesson that I have put here. Is that not clear by any chance? I said classes inherit from classes of type object, yeah, understandably. We share the same thing, right? Same lesson.
Yeah, same thing. But what I said, it's like a trick question.
Yeah, it's a trick
first show
question, absolutely.
Class new and then string new.
Agreed. It's a trick question, but this typically is a thought that people have in mind when they do it. So we share the same thing, in essence. The lesson's the same. Yeah, okay. Are we all clear on that? Yeah, okay. So in classes, there's no connection between a class and the object's instance variable. This is one other thing in Ruby. We'll see it visually what it is. So if I have a class, my class, and one of the objects have its instance variable at where, and there's another instance variable at where too, it doesn't, there is no mandate that any other object of, that's an instance of my class will have the same instance variable. You can have a different instance variable. And it might not have any instance variable at all. Now there is a reason to it. Typically in Ruby, instance variable comes live only when an assignment is made to it, only when an assignment is first made to it, not otherwise. So this is not the case in in Java or C#, right? So if I have templated my class, then I know, if my class has got instance variables A, B, and C, any variable, any instance of a class will always have those variables. That's not the case with Ruby. Quick quiz. This is little out of what I've been talking all through. So this is for the other experienced folks or somewhere who are in my state. Can somebody think in Ruby, what do you think is an equivalent to Java or a C# interface? Module is one, okay. Sorry? Okay, I'll just shoot with the answer. Interfaces are irrelevant in Ruby. Why? Because in Ruby it's all duck typing. Yeah. So invariably, anything that we pick up in Ruby, any plugin or any coding, you don't really think of an interface. This is one other thing that I had when I had started coding in Ruby. I was like wondering, okay, where is the contract? I mean, there is no design by contract in Ruby. We don't work or code that way. So this is one line of difference or a paradigm shift that we have to digest if we have to code in Ruby. The other thing is self. Okay, yeah, please.
I haven't studied Java very much, but I studied Common Lisp. Common Lisp has interfaces, and there's a good book, small but expensive book by Sonia, somebody, the Common Lisp object system, and it's probably the best explanation, irregardless of language, of what an interface is, and it has to do with protocols more than anything. So, like, how do you create those protocols? And I mean, sometimes you really want an interface, and the book explains why. But can you explain how you do that in Ruby?
Okay, so nice question. So in Ruby, the community goes more by the convention. Now, as an example, I can give the Flickr's client plugins, whatever you pick up, it will not have any contracts defined in it. So that is because tomorrow if Flickr is going to add more methods at the server level, the way Ruby works is it's going to do dynamic dispatching. And your existing client Flickr plugin that you're going to have, absolutely. So I'll just give one example for that. There is one there are a couple of special cases. In Ruby, the spaceship operator or the comparable operator, the enumerator, for instance, they have contracts defined. And where it is really needed, what they do it through modules, which is what some of them have answered. But by and large, what people do is they don't really go by that design by contract. But there are certain occasions, yes, as we have told, which mandates for such a contract. In such cases, yeah, what we do is we start using modules in Ruby, which I'll talk about in my forthcoming slides. Oh, you have a question, sorry.
One point. So, the difference here is that when you do it using modules, so you can only enforce it as a runtime dependency. Only a runtime contract is possible, even in that case. There is no running, of course.
Very true. I mean, after all, there is nothing, it's not static, right? So that's a buy-in that we're going to take. But then nothing, I mean, you can always have a module that's going to have methods which is going to throw exceptions of sorts. Yeah. Now, self in Ruby is one other thing where initially when people start working, find it a little confusing. And it is not too confusing at all in reality if we can quickly cover through these slides. Self is not the same as this in Java. We just have to digest that. And the time we do unlearning in Java or C#, I mean, this is going to do good for us. Now, self is synonymous to a current or a default object, sorry. Now, who gets to be self or who gets to be the current object that self is going to point to depends on where self is placed in the code. And for that, we'll walk through an example. Now, code is an unbeatable teaching aid, and I've just taken a very simple example for that. Now, we have self defined outside of class at a topmost level. And I've also defined self within the scope of a class to see what self points to. Also, I define self in a class method, and there comes a method definition where I have tried to use self to figure out where self points to. As long as we are clear on this example as to what self points to, we can just be sure that tomorrow, wherever we see self in a code, I mean, you're pretty sure, okay, what object it points to. Now, let's take this as the first example. Now, at topmost level, self is, it's going to point to, absolutely, it's going to point to main, because that is the topmost layer that is going to hold all the objects. Now within the class scope, when I define self, it's going to point to the class itself, yeah, the class, the object my class, if I would like to put it that way, yeah. And now inside a class method, understandably, it is going to refer to a class. Now in an instance method, it is going to point to an instance of myself. So, which is what I try to do here. And the other thing that is there, now we are all familiar with class variables and instance variables. Ruby has got something called as class instance variables. Now what it is, we'll go with a code example again. Now, I have defined a class with variables used, I mean, within the scope of a class. And then in initialize, I did use a couple of variables. Okay, and I want you all to make a random, educated guess, not a random guess, educated guess on what's going to be the output here. It is absolutely okay to make mistake, because when we make mistake, I mean, our mind is tuned to self-correction. So try making an educated guess here. Now, it's going to be P, it's going to be S. Any other answers? It's going to be P, it's going to be S, it's going to be P and S. It's going to be P and Q, okay. It's going to be PQR, okay. Only S. Okay, so we are talking about class instance variable here, and it's going to be P. Reason being, now class instance variable is typically an instance variable that sort of is very how should I call it? It's an instance variable that is private to the class only. Now here, if you look at it, within the scope of a class, I have P and I have at P and at Q. Now because at Q is not assigned, it is not going to come alive. And because P is there and it's been made an assignment, that becomes a class instance variable. Now, and at this instant, there isn't any objects initialized, so we don't have anything else. So that is the reason why S hasn't come. Okay? So that's about our lessons, what you have learned in the previous slides. Now try making an educated guess again. Okay, it's T. Fantastic. So I don't have to explain this. Yeah. So in Ruby, as long as you give an at T, and whether you define within a class scope or within a method, it's going to be a class variable. Now I've initialized. Okay, I've created a new object of type A, and what is going to be the output now? Okay, so you're all clear on this, yeah? I mean, we learn by our own examples. So now here, what is going to be the output now? Class variables of A is at T and at R. You have missed the at T that's defined within the class scope. I told you, as long as you have defined at variable name, I mean, it's going to be a class variable, yeah? Now access modifiers, I'll run through quickly because I've got about 15 minutes left. Public is the default access modifier for all the methods. We have private, we have protected even. Then access modifiers apply until the end of scope or until another access modifier pops up somewhere between the code. Now that's an important lesson that we need to understand because when a code file grows along, you just have to search through, I mean, where you're going to have the method definition inserted. Yeah, so this is the common practice in which we we define methods, and the scope of each method is dependent on in which section each one falls under. Now, method M, for instance, a public method, and then a private scope pops up. So method M2 and M3 becomes private, and M4 would have been private if it is not for the protected keyword that has popped in. Now, access modifiers are actually methods. So what we can do is, we can have something like this. What we have defined previously, we can have it this way even. Here, of course, the public method passing M1 to it is redundant because it's going to be the default method modifier, access modifier. Now, there's something that I want to talk about, private and protected. Private is very special in Ruby. Private access modifier in Ruby is not the same as it is in Java or C#. In fact, protected is the way it is in Java or C#. Just that's a quick tip. So we'll see what it is by an example. Now, if I have a class which has got a public method defined and I pass another object to it, wherein, you see in dark, right, other dot my protected method. So we have my public method, and this is going to work. The second one doesn't work because the place at which I have defined, the place at which I'm invoking, okay. So for the people, it's not visible. So what I'm doing is I'm calling mc1.myProtected method directly. Okay, the line that is there on a red, it's not visible. I'm sorry about it. So if I try to invoke a protected method directly outside a class, it is going to bomb with no method error. Yeah, because that behaves like private in Java. That's a quick thing. So let's go through a quick example. Now, if I have a method talk defined and I'm calling in a private method confident here, can we, and then I'm instantiating a speaker and then calling talk. What do you think is going to be the output? Quickly. Okay, lecture and no method error. Okay, no method error is the answer. Why? We have a lesson here. Private methods ought to be called, private methods can be called only by an implicit receiver. That's a rule in Ruby. So that's one rule that you need to think of, and not even self. Yeah, you cannot have an explicit receiver. So now, quick quiz again. We talked about access modifiers for methods. How about the instance variables? Any guesses? How about access modifiers for instance variable? I did not talk about that. Okay, access modifiers don't apply to instance variables because they remain private always. Now, access to instance variables are only through getter and setter methods. That's why people who are familiar to it will always write attribute accessors or setters accordingly. So that's the way it is. And quickly about singleton methods. This is just a single line that you need to remember to know what a singleton method is. A method defined to be specific to a single object. As long as we can remember this method, that's all a singleton method is. An example. Now I have a statement, Karthik is speaking at RubyConf India 2011, and I define a method exclusively for this object statement. Statement is understandably an object of type string. Yeah? Now I say really to it and then it returns true. So this one is going to return true. Yeah. Now I will create another statement where Karthik is bullshitting at RubyConf India 2011. In the context of a code, what do you think is the answer? Okay, it's going to be undefined method error, yeah? Because, I have not defined a method specific to this object. So, now there is a pattern to it. Now, if you look through the previous thing, I've said statement dot really, right? I mean, I've defined a method exclusive to that object. This is where it is important. Classes are also objects. Now, I'm saying my class dot, I'm creating, let's say I'm defining a method. I'm sorry, the example isn't clear. So I say, if I define a method, my class dot, my class method, and then I do a definition. So something like this. If I say def, in place of statement, I have my class dot really, let's say, okay, and it's going to return true. Now, both are similar, right? Just that here a statement is an object, and my class, though is a class, is of a type object. So that's what this statement is trying to explain, which is to say that class methods are indeed singleton methods. So every time we say, think of class methods, they think it is going to be singleton methods. But where do methods live? I mean, it depends. So for all the instance method, it is going to reside in the my class object. But my classes itself are going to, because I said my class object, class methods are all singleton methods. What happens in Ruby is, when I define a class method, it goes and resides in something like this. I mean, every time we define a class method, an eigen class or a ghost class is created like this. And the method definition would be in this. So every time you add class methods, what happens is this method, this object is where your class method resides. Now, for an object where we define, singleton methods for an object, like the case like statement, it's going to reside in its corresponding eigenclass. So, if my object also will have a corresponding eigenclass, okay? So, every object will have a corresponding eigenclass if you were to try to create a singleton method to it specifically. So, one other thing that we need to think of is in Ruby there is no function call, it is all about messages, it's all about message passing. Now, as a Java programmer, if you were to see duck.quack, he'll think of it as invoking a method. But a Ruby programmer will think of it as message passing. And that is precisely the reason why there is no method overloading at all. You don't get to see it at books, but we get to understand it by experience. Yeah, so you don't have a method overloading at all in Ruby. Now, modules. I told you classes and modules are sort of same, just about that the intent is different in the usage. So, okay, module has got my constant defined within it, and then my constant is defined within my class. So, if I do the scope of, so what it does is it's doing scoping. It's doing namespacing. So, namespacing is one usage of module. Another example of it is module is used as a better alternative to multiple inheritance. Ruby, like Java, doesn't support multiple inheritance. But then it favors, the design principle that, favor composition over inheritance. That precisely is the reason where, you start using modules. Quickly, we go through a code example, and we see some of the interesting ways in which modules are used. Now, the first case is, if I have to include my module's instance methods as instance method of my class, then what I have to do is, I just have to use the include word. And then I do my module. My class will have all the instance methods of the my module. The other case is, I might want to have instance methods of my modules as class methods of my class. In such a case, you can do in either or ways. You can open up the class definition, and now you see the two less than operator self. What it does is, the moment you see class double less than operator and self, it opens up a corresponding eigen class to it, and it adds these class methods. That is what happens. And this is so frequently used that in Ruby we start having an extend keyword. So, quick quiz. So I have my module with a class method as my freaking method, and then I have my class and include my module. So if I do my class dot my freaking method, what do you think is going to be the output? Quickly. Okay, error is one answer that I'm getting from a group here. Any other answers? Okay, so it's going to be no method error. The reason being, when you include a module, it is only the module's instance method that gets included. The class methods of a module are all excluded. And we have something to talk about the method lookup. This is the way I visualize when I have to do Ruby. We do a lot of kata, so this sort of helps us in visualizing, the method lookup. So we'll see this thing. Imagine there is an object, and we define a superclass S, and we also define a derived class D of S, and I'm creating 2 instances of D. So, and let's say I'm adding independent methods to the objects D, okay, the 2 objects that you see here. Now when I add singleton methods to it, what happens is a corresponding eigenclass gets opened. The classes that you see in black are eigenclasses, which are otherwise called as ghost classes. I mean, Dave Thomas has christened it that way. And the advantage is this. So the eigenclasses also inherit this way. So I have let's say an object has got class methods this way, and I have a superclass S which has got some class methods here. Similarly, D has got some class methods here. The eigenclasses are sort of worked in such a way that the class methods of a class gets inherited here, and it just boils down this way. This is about the way in which method lookup essentially works. So when we do D dot some method, it first tries to see if the method is there in its eigenclass, corresponding eigenclass. If it is not there, it tries and goes goes one level up and see if it exists in D's eigenclass. If it is not there, it goes to D. If it is not there in D, it goes to S class's eigenclass. And then if it is not there, it goes to S, and similarly it goes upwards. So that's about my talk. These are some of the resources that I felt very, very useful. I had read hordes of books about Ruby, but the basic understanding has come from these resources. So there's a pickaxe books that are very famous. That is nothing but the Programming Ruby by Dave Thomas. And the Meta-Programming Ruby by Paulo Perotto is one other excellent book. It's a must-read. It is not for intermediate or advanced Ruby programmers. In fact, literally, these guys starting Ruby can actually pick up the book and start reading. It's littered with a lot of code examples. My own thought process evolved better by reading these books. And then there is this Well-Grounded Rubyist by David A. Black, which helped me. And then Jim Verich is one awesome author who tries to explain things by code. Most of his articles are all there in the onestepback.org website. Please do take a look at it. And Jay Fields has some interesting blogs on the way Ruby functions. So now if you have any other questions, we can always take it up. Any questions? So, oh yeah.
Yeah, hi. You said something about private methods that we cannot call them explicitly, right?
Yeah.
So can you give us an example of the implicit, like how can you work with that? Like you don't usually see that in code examples.
So
how do you work with private methods?
Yeah, the only way you do it is just remove the word self from it, and it's going to work. So what we typically do coming from another language, I mean, for the sake of elegance, we might say self.private method. All you need to do is just remove that self, and it's going to work. There's nothing tedious or nothing fancy about it. Just remove the word self. The rule says that do not attach a receiver to it. I mean, it has to be an implicit receiver. That's all the rule is, and it's going to work fine. Yeah. Okay.
You mentioned that for avoiding multiple inheritance, the design pattern that is followed is composition over inheritance. But that is not exactly like, it is not specific to multiple inheritance. Design principle, composition over inheritance can be even followed when you have single inheritance. It depends on the scenario.
Yeah. I agree. So Ruby as such, I mean, doesn't support it, right? I mean, even when it is possible, you say, I mean, try going for this.
Composition.
But here is way something, I mean, Ruby supports it to the extent that you have it by modules, just the way I wanted to put it across. Yeah.
So when we actually import a lot of these modules and all that, and this is function coming from one of those modules, like, I mean, typically an object gets in, I mean, especially in the Rails world, has a whole lot of modules that are included.
Oh, yeah.
And if you want to see where this method comes from, apart from raising an exception somewhere, is there a way to quickly find out that this method is coming from this module?
Oh, so that's a very interesting thing, and the only way you find it out in Ruby, because there is no tooling thing, and the only way you do it is do a grep. But what is to be taken care of is, sorry.
No, there is another way. You should use
Oh,
a
yeah.
method method. And if you use a method on a method, then the output will print which module it was defined in.
Okay, so in a cases, correct me if I'm wrong. Let's say I'm having two modules, module A and module B, and I'm going to include it in a class, my class. Now, both the modules have same method, let's say a method M1 that gets included. Now, it depends in class which method gets, is the final method that's going to be defined. It depends on the order of inclusion, right? Whatever you're saying, it still holds good, is it? I mean, it's fail-proof is what you're saying. Okay, yep. There's an answer, thanks. Yeah.
Hi, Karthik, we have time for just one more question.
Oh, yeah.
Who wants to be the lucky one?
We just have one more after this. Yes.
When you talked
Sorry,
about
he's asking questions.
when you talked about private, protected, and public, what is the logic behind it, and how do you use it to model the code? Like, what I mean to ask is like, why is it designed the way it is designed, and how can you use it? Like, if you, correct, I mean, I think people have said that don't use private protected, just use public, and
Well,
having said that, that's not the question. The question is like, why is it like public protected the way it is? Like, why is it like self is the thing which you have to take care of, and what is the logic behind it?
No, it all depends on your usage, right? I mean, there is no hard and fast rule. So I told you, like, protected is like the way it is in Java or C#, the behavior if you say it. So all the other instances too can knows that its sibling object has the same method and it's going to work. But private is truly private. I mean, you're in your own object. I mean, if you want to write, you can call private only within the object's own other classes, be it public or protected. Does that answer your question? I mean, that depends upon your usage. I mean, about the need for it.
When would you use private, and when would you use, like, in practically when will you use it? I personally just use public and live with it, like.
I think that's more about the demand, right? I mean, you always have private and public methods. If you're using all public, I think you have exposed to things too much about what your class can do. So, right. Can we answer just one last question? I think it's got just one last. Yeah, I'm winding up.
Elementary question. What's symptoms that Ruby has that show that its message uses method passing? Because I don't really understand this method passing stuff, except that, like, I know that one advantage of it is that you never get any exceptions. I mean, you can handle the exceptions if there's not a handler for the message.
So the one thing about message passing is that when we don't really have to define. Sorry, we don't really have to define. Now, supposing there comes a time when I don't know what method I'm going to call. Okay, let's say I have a class A and it's going to call some server-side code. I don't really know, what method I'm going to call based on demand. So what I can do is, because I know it is message passing and I know the conventions, I can just reroute it. All I can do is I can dispatch the method. I mean, this object can delegate the method call to the other thing. So this book about that I told you, meta programming in Ruby, I mean that gives some nice examples about how message passing helps. The classical spell being dynamic, proxies, or some of these spells that book explains, where this sort of helps. Yeah, if I'm right.
Great. Thanks, Karthik. It's been interesting. Small token of appreciation from us. We have a quick 10-minute break now at 2:30. At this hall, Sidhu and Niranjan are going to be talking about a session called Icon has HTTP. And over at Spring, Pankaj is going to be talking about making your own Rails framework. We'll see you at the other side of this break.